Hello, a bit of a different video for you today. We're going to be doing a book review. I'm going to be talking about Pet Sematary, of course, the classic horror novel by the legendary Stephen King. I am a bit of a fan of Stephen King. I've read quite a few of his books, but I actually never read this one until just recently. I've seen both of the film adaptations. I really like the 80s film version. I think that's a really solid little horror movie. But yeah, I'd been meaning to read Pet Sematary for a long time. Finally got around to it. One of the reasons I really wanted to read this was because of all of Stephen King's books, Stephen King has gone on record and said that he thinks this is the scariest book he's written. So he said in a couple of interviews, and actually even in the intro to this, that he thinks it's his scariest book. So that, that I think is enough to kind of intrigue me to want to read the book. And I found this copy on sale. So I thought, you know what, this is the perfect time to read Pet Sematary. Now, I'm not going to really go through much of the plot. I'm sure most people are aware of the story of Pet Sematary because, both the novel and film have been around for, a fair bit of time at this point. But just as a basic setup, we follow the story of Dr. Lewis Creed, who moves with his family from Chicago to Maine because it's Stephen King, so of course they move to Maine. They meet their neighbour, Judge Crandall, and they have this nice big house, and there's a trail in the fields at the back of their house that leads to a pet cemetery, and a bunch of things, go wrong, as they often do in Stephen King novels. Now, one sort of common criticism I see of Stephen King, particularly in regards to his novels, is that he tends to ramble on a bit sometimes. I've seen a few reviews of a few different Stephen King books where people have said, I like the story, I like Stephen King, but man, I wish he had an editor or someone to just tell him, you can cut this down, this doesn't need to be this long and rambly. And there's a couple of King books I've read where I think that is certainly true. However, I actually think that in the case of Pet Sematary, the kind of the very slow build-up actually really works in its favour. Because King does two things I think really well here in the first kind of half of the book. He kind of establishes the main characters, the family, and also Judd, their neighbour. He really kind of builds them up, and you really get to know the characters, and you really get to feel for the characters. So when the events of the novel happen as they do, you really feel for them, I guess. And also there is a lot of foreshadowing in this, in the first half of this novel. Like, King is really good at dropping little hints of what's to come, and sometimes even just flat out telling you this is going to happen in a few chapters, not so subtly hinting at it. And so that kind of creates this sense of tension. There are certain scenes that happen in the book that really kind of start to build that tension to something big and horrible happening, which it inevitably does because, again, it is a Stephen King novel. There's the usual things of some supernatural elements and stuff, which I think Stephen King does a lot as well. But yeah, I really like the slow build-up in the first half of the novel. And then when we get to the second half of the novel, a big tragic event happens, which, again, if you know the story, you know what that big tragic event is. And this, for me, is where the book really becomes kind of I guess like a feel-bad novel. Because that part of the book is very depressing and very bleak. Everyone is, this big tragedy happens and everyone is very sad and very angry. And, and we see kind of how the different characters deal with this big tragedy and deal with grief. And I think that's a really fascinating and really powerful part of the novel. Not always easy to read, for sure, because it does get very dark and, like I say, very depressing and a bit grim. But if you go into it expecting that, I think it does a really, really good job. I think King does a really good job of exploring kinds of the themes of grief and depression in that in that part of the novel. And then when we get to the last third, the last 100 to 150 pages, then it really picks up the pace. For as much of a slow burn as this novel is, the last quarter of it just goes so fast. And actually, I really like the last quarter of this. The last quarter of this novel kind of reminds me of why I love Stephen King as a short story writer. Because I think in the last part of Pet Sematary and in a lot of his short stories, King is very good at, having a lot of things happen at once, having a lot of, situations escalate very, very quickly, but never feeling like he's rushing it. The last part of the novel is very fast-paced, but it doesn't feel rushed. He still, lets all the horrible things linger, and, or he still goes into detail, and like I say, nothing feels rushed, but it does pick up the pace in the last 150 pages or so. The last part of this novel, I was reading really, really quickly, and I'm not the fastest reader in the world, but it just sort of you know, after that big, long, slow build-up, it kind of grabs you and goes, okay, nearly at the end, let's go, which I really, really liked. And again, I think that's something I see a lot in King's short fiction. I actually slightly prefer Stephen King's short stories to his novels in a lot of cases, but this is still a really, really good one. I'm really glad I read this. Pet Sematary, fantastic book. If you're not a fan of bleak, depressing books, maybe give this one a skip, because like I say, at times it does get very dark and very sad and very tragic and very grim. And then at the end, all the like horrific stuff starts happening. Again, King never really is one to shy away from guts and gore as well. And there's a bit of that in this. It's not his most bloody of novels, but there are a few very graphic bits in it, or quite graphic bits in it at least. But yeah, if you don't mind the graphic stuff and the horror stuff, and you don't mind the tragic and sad, depressing stuff, Pet Sematary, I think, is a really good novel and a really good example of a slow burn. Again, sometimes King can ramble on a bit, as I'm doing in this video, clearly. But I think in this case, the rambling and the kind of the slow build really, really pays off, especially in that very fast-paced final kind of quarter. So yeah, Pet Sematary, I would put this close to the top of my favourite Stephen King novels. Maybe not my absolute favourite. I still think Salem's Lot is probably my favourite of King's longer books, of his novels, certainly. Or maybe The Stand. The Stand and Salem's Lot are both ones that I hold in really kind of high regard. But this absolutely is up there with among King's best work. And yeah, I'm really, really glad that I finally picked this up and finally read it. And I might need to go rewatch the older film adaptation of it now, because that's, like I say, really good, solid film adaptation. But yeah, let me know what you think of Pet Sematary down in the comments. Do you really like the slow burn effect? Do you think it does ramble on a bit, as some of King's other books tend to do? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them down in the comments. We'll have a chat about it. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know if you want to see me do more book reviews as well. So yeah, thanks for watching. That's all I've got for you. Bye.